if you gave me some other 10,000 dimensional vector, right, you know, 3 guys on a bicycle, and I try to make that image by just summing up 100 eigenvectors from the face space, how well do you think I can reconstruct that image? Not so well. The only images I can reconstruct well are faces. So I could do the reconstruction and compare them and say, aha, bad choice. This is not a face image. It also means, by the way, if I'm looking for faces in a picture, I might do that. In fact, in the original Turk and Penland, they actually did detection that way. There are now better ways to just detect raw faces, but the ability to reconstruct is a way of knowing that, yep, I actually have what I was looking for. I'm going to use to see if I can reconstruct to do some tracking, but hang on, that's for the next lecture. But for the recognition part, it's optional. Let's assume it really is a face. Well, then all we can do is we can say, all right, you gave me these W's, right, 1 through K. Let me find in my list the one that's closest of those K numbers. I might use a Euclidean distance, some other distance metric, but basically I have a description of a new face coming in, and I just see which of the descriptions in my database is closest. And that's why you can think of this somewhat as a generative model. There's actually more detail to use it in a more probabilistic way. We'll actually talk a little bit about that in the tracking. But the idea is that each one of these descriptions gives me a probability, if you will, or a likelihood of what this person's face might look like, because it assumes that this has captured most of the variation and that the other stuff doesn't matter too much. And if a new one comes in, I can just compare them. And if I get closer, that's more likely. And that's why it's a generative model. So when this was first put together, here's an old cast of characters, and there's 2 funny things for me to tell you. The first is, you talk about, you know, missing a trademarking opportunity, right? So when Matt Turk and Sandy Pentland were putting this together, they had in mind this notion of mugshot books. You know, mugshots where page through this book of all these face images, and you say, aha, that's the person. So they were putting together something that was going to be kind of like a mugshot book, but of faces, and it was going to be an electronic program. So what do you think they called this electronic program that was supposed to be a book of faces? Photo book. So, you know, there you go, Zuckerberg. Hope you're happy. Facebook was invented and called photo book, and so then Facebook could be Facebook. So that's humorous story number 1. Humorous story number 2 is actually not humorous at all. It actually speaks to sort of the productivity of the Media Lab, the vision and modeling group at the time. This old cast of characters here, a bunch of these people were students. In fact, almost all these people here were students at the time. Oh, no, there's Mike Bove. He was a research scientist. But some of you may know Stan Sklarov, who was chair of Boston University Computer Science. Well, that's him right there. Some of you ever heard of G+? All right. So Bradley Horowitz at Google was instrumental in making that happen. He's right there. I think that's him, or is that him? Those 2 may be the same person. Okay. Anybody up in Berkeley? Trevor Darrell, computer vision researcher. Or here at Georgia Tech, there's Professor Irfan Issa. Neither he nor I look like we used to look like when we were at the Media Lab at the time, but that really is him. So it just tells you a little bit about sort of the density of interesting vision research going on there at the time. But basically what they did was they produced a database, 8,000 faces, and it was able to do recognition. You think it's perfect? Of course not. There are some problems. One problem is, remember I told you that the way you do the dot product, since these are images, the vectors, you can just line them up and multiply them? That was the dot product. That's how you take the dot product of these 2 10,000 dimensional vectors. That should have made you wonder, well, what happens if it's misaligned? Right? The eyes aren't exactly in the right place. Okay? The scale is a little bit different. The answer is it doesn't work very well. Right? It really requires good alignment, scaling. Also, the background has to be not too terrible. That can be done, but it is a sensitivity of the method. Another cute little story. At the time, they had these 8,000 faces, and they wanted to put them in a scaled, lined-up way. And so you could imagine trying to write a computer program that would sort of find where the eyes were and then line them up. Or you could pay an undergraduate. So they paid an undergraduate to click on the pupils of the eyes of each picture of the 8,000 pictures. I think his first name was Wasi. I can't remember. If you're out there, my apologies. And what was great is, Sandy will tell you, is as the student was working on these 8,000 pictures, he came back and said, I have a new appreciation for what order of magnitude means, because the difference between doing 80 pictures and 8,000 pictures, as you can imagine, took a long time. But you basically have to line this up. Now, you can use methods to automatically align the eyes, scale, etc., and then that kind of thing will work. Another limitation that is sort of a more theoretical basis for PCA in general, principal component analysis, typically the way you do it is you take your entire population, you find the direction of variance over the whole population, you project down along those dimensions, and then you try to discriminate between the different classes. In this data here, we have blue points and we have red points, but if the first thing you did was find the axis of elongation, okay, the axis along which there's the most variation, all right, and you projected these points down, well, clearly you will confuse the blue points and the red points, right? So it happens to be that the way of separating the classes, right, so the direction along which you want to separate the classes is not the direction along which all the points are distributed. There is methods in pattern recognition, Fisher analysis, linear discriminant analysis for using not just the structure of the population but the structure of the classes to determine which way to separate. We won't talk about them here because it's kind of an old method, but it actually talks more about the discriminative methods that we'll talk about not next time but the time after. The idea is saying that, well, I don't need so much to model the points themselves, because the points are elongated this way. I need to model the separation between the points. So a limitation of PCA is that sometimes the direction of maximum variance is not always the best direction to project on for doing classification. That ends the lesson on PCA. It's a very general method. People use principal components all the time. And the face recognition method is just what we use to introduce it, although I will say it's become very well known because not just because of how well it worked and sort of caught people by surprise, but just it had this very clean interpretation. In fact, now you'll hear, instead of eigenfaces, you'll hear about eigengates. Right? So you take measurements of people walking, you try to find a principal component analysis, project them down and do it. There are eigenbody shapes, which is terrifying to think about, but basically the idea is people vary in different shapes, and I should be able to take a small number of variations and say I can fit you by just a small number of control knobs. If you're doing computer graphics animation and you want to be able to control the different shapes of people to build different characters, you want to be able to just turn a small number of knobs and have people change their overall build, their height, things like that, and you can use this principal component analysis or more sophisticated versions of it to do that. The method that I've shown you here also is a linear method, right? All these things are orthogonal, and I can compute the coefficients by just taking the dot products. And that's a nice property to have. It makes things easy to do. But it's also a liability. If I have just say a three-dimensional space, suppose I have points that actually just lie along a curve. Okay? So they're all on a single curve, which means if you just told me the value along that curve, that would represent the point completely, assuming I knew the curve. But it's not a line, it's a curve. Okay? So it bends. So there are nonlinear methods of doing principal component analysis that allow you to capture sort of nonlinear lower dimensional manifolds. We won't talk about it here, but in fact there's one's called nonlinear kernel PCA. But for now, all you need to know about is what we talked about here: linear orthogonal decomposition of principal components. All right, welcome back to Computer Vision. Last time we introduced principal component analysis as a way of doing dimensionality reduction, going from a high space to a low space. And we said it only works if the signal actually is present in that lower dimensional space. In particular, you could only reconstruct an image well using a small number of low-dimensional small number of basis images or eigenvectors if the image itself was kind of like that, right? I can only make faces out of eigenfaces. I can't make bicycles or tortilla chips. So that gave us a little insight as to you might use that to do detection, right? So if I want to find a face, I might look for patches that can be well described, reconstructed using just that low dimension. So there's a related task that we can use this method for, and that's what's called appearance-based tracking. All right? So here's the basic idea. Learn something about what a target looks like, maybe not just a single image, but the possible variations, by capturing a low-dimensional space, being able to reconstruct, and then you're going to track that target around by finding the place that you can reconstruct the best. All right, so that's the basic idea. And what's cool about this is, instead of like some of the previous tracking where if you learn new appearance every time step, you might drift, that is, you eventually get stuck on something that's not the object, here you might be more robust to that. So, as I mentioned, in sort of a conventional or traditional tracking approach, what you do is you build a model before something starts moving, right? So you might cut out a patch, find a contour, some method of describing the object, and then you do remember we talked about optic flow, where you essentially connect the dots. You do patch tracking with particles, which if you're in the OMS class, you did as a problem set. Or you might even solve some interesting complicated optimization problem. And then somehow you try to incorporate some invariance. So you might use edges because you know that those don't change a lot depending upon how the illumination changes, let's say. All right? But the problem is, if I'm going to track an object over an extended period of time, the object and the environment tend to change. And what I would like to do is I would like to not just track the object, but in some sense track the changes, incorporate the changes slowly as the object moves. So some work that we're going to talk about, and these are some slides taken from Yang, who did a piece of work that I'll talk about along with Ross et al. They took some inspiration from two places. First of all, Michael Black and Alan Jepson, way back in 1996, did something called eigentracking. So you guys know all about eigenfaces. Well, eigentracking was the same idea, but the idea is, so here we have Coca-Cola cans, and here we have these eigenimages. Oh, this one's a 7-Up can. How did that get in there? Okay, we have eigenimages of these different objects. And the idea was, we're going to track this thing by finding places that we can represent well using those eigenimages. But one of the cool things they did was, they said, you know, remember what didn't work so well in eigenanalysis, the eigenface, was the alignment. Things had to be aligned perfectly. Well, suppose we decompose the problem into the geometric part. That is, how is my object moving, maybe rotating, scaling, to what does it look like? Now, we've already seen this, right? When we were doing the good features to track, we talked about, in fact, there was an image of a speed limit sign getting bigger and bigger and was being tracked, and the idea was it's the same image patch, it just deforms. Well, there they were using a single image patch. In the eigentracking, the idea was that we're going to look for a deformation, so it could be affine, could be otherwise, where we have translation, rotation, scaling, maybe even shearing. But now, instead of just taking a single patch, we actually have a set of eigenvectors that describe the cocan. So, for example, maybe if I rotate the cocan a little bit, or maybe some other change, I could represent all those different appearances. When they did it, it was done in sort of a nonlinear optimization way, but more importantly, they took a fixed basis set. So they took a whole bunch of images of Coke cans, created a basis set, and said, that's our Coca-Cola basis set. So we're going to need to do some improvement on that. The other inspiration here is also something that we've covered, which was particle filtering. Remember, Izard and Blake, they, instead of having a single proposal, the idea is you'd have a bunch of particles, and each particle would represent a possible location. And that allowed us to handle sort of non-parametric densities, right? Use a sampling-based approach. And there, what they were using were like contours, right? And they would propagate this over time. They would move the particles forward. To do incremental visual tracking using principal component analysis, what we want to do is we want to build a tracker that's not just based upon a single patch, but sort of constantly updates some form of a model. And between me and you, that model is going to be a basis set. So we're going to keep changing the basis set a little bit as the model moves. We want something that runs quickly and can operate even if the camera's moving. And of course, the general challenge here is we would like this thing to be able to handle if the pose is changing, so how the thing is moving, rotating, translating. Maybe parts of it get occluded. Okay, and we'll talk about how to handle occlusion in just a bit. You have illumination change, and you want to avoid drift. That is, you don't want to start tracking someone's face, and all of a sudden you realize you're just tracking the bottom half of their face, and then it just gets stuck on a file cabinet. Right? You want to stick to their face. So.